The newest adventure by RGG Studio has finally come out, and given its experimental nature, opinions on the entry have been quite varied. It may have only been a week since its release, as of the time of writing, but journalists and casual fans alike have been fairly split on the more carefree, fun approach of the game compared to its more somber, character drama-heavy predecessors. Now, given that my channel largely revolves around the Yakuza series, my views on the game will likely differ from those, as anyone with extensive experience with the series knows that one of RGG's bigger qualities is their drive to explore different avenues, both gameplay-wise and story-wise. So, what's the verdict on Pirate Yakuza? Personally, it felt like the type of relaxing and fun experience I'd get from my favorite games from the PS2 era, which includes the first two Yakuza games. This new entry is a classic action game experience by RGG, so for the people who weren't fans of the more recent turn-based endeavors, having someone like Majima slash his way through the map could bring you back to what many consider the gold standard for a Yakuza game. On the other hand, the experimentation shown in Pirate Yakuza's sea exploration and naval combat helps give you that unique blend of excitement that no project since maybe Black Flag could truly grant. Also, given that this is another Gaiden game in structure, it means the critical path of Pirate Yakuza won't take up too much of your spare time. Though, between the commendable amount of side content present and the combat system that will bring out your inner DMC enthusiast, you will likely find yourself investing dozens of more hours into this game long after the credits roll. If you'll recall how positive I was over a game like the original Gaiden, you'll notice how many of the general positives I listed bear a striking resemblance to the experience that game granted, though my reservations with this specific entry will vary quite a bit from it. In short, if you're just a casual fan checking if Pirate Yakuza is worth your time from the perspective of a longtime fan, the short answer is yes. The not-so-short answer is still yes, and will comprise the rest of this video, in the hopes of painting a more detailed picture for hardcore Yakuza fans who may still be on the fence about the game. With all of that said, let's begin. We'll start by addressing the usual question tied to any new Yakuza game, which would be the length. Between the 5 chapters that comprise this game's core structure, I found myself investing roughly 15 hours on the critical path alone. This effectively puts the game somewhere between the original Gaiden and a number of the early Dragon Engine entries like Yakuza 6 and Judgment in terms of main story length. While the opening chapter may have been a slower start than normal, which makes sense in the grander scope and tone of the story, I still found myself properly gripped by the experience around the latter half of Chapter 2. You are steadily introduced to different traversable areas, new weapons to use, as well as some of the more prominent side content a la ship battles and island exploration. Having said that, there is one design choice that's been increasingly prominent in more recent RGG games that I feel the need to point out here: the premise of mandatory side content. On numerous occasions, most notably in Chapter 2, the story will grind to a halt, so that you may be introduced to things like cooking, island exploration, the new betting minigame, photo rally, camel up, etc. While the extent to which this derails the critical path personally felt less problematic here than with Infinite Wealth, this design choice will likely be the most prominently brought up issue with this game, and for good reason. Speaking as someone who always does the side content in these games after finishing the story anyway, I feel like the more frequent implementation of normally optional content into the critical path is only resulting in more and more people calling the stories of the newer games diluted, even though the stories are genuinely compelling. We've seen it happen with the original Gaiden already, and while New Game Plus in Pirate Yakuza could alleviate some of the criticism from repeating here, we need to see a course correction with this moving forward. Have the mandatory tutorials be exclusive to truly massive side activities, and let the players seek the rest out for themselves, like with the older entries. The games are amazing enough in their own right to where players will want to try everything, and this way they won't be subjected to real filler upon their future replays. Having said that, I still believe that the so-called length to substance ratio is greatly in Pirate Yakuza's favor overall. and the further along you are in the story, the more excited you'll be to see how the adventure continues to twist and turn. Now, granted, you might be a gamer who more so cares about the gameplay of a new entry rather than its overall structure and narrative nuance, so we might as well transition to discussing one of this game's biggest highlights, the combat. So, you know how normally when you have a Yakuza game with two styles, one of them will be intended for single enemies and the other for group encounters? Well, that was the case with the Yakuza and Agent styles in Gaiden as well. So you'd think a similar premise would be reprised here, but in reality, Pirate Yakuza instead feels like a clash of OG Judgment's and Lost Judgment's philosophies in terms of style utility. Imagine if you took the Tiger style from the first game, i.e. something that was amazing in both group and boss encounters, and then you added the Crane style from Lost Judgment as the second one, being the style that truly shined at crowd control in a league of its own. Well, that's what wielding Pirate Yakuza's new styles felt like. Starting with Mad Dog, it effectively takes the best aspects of Thug style from Yakuza 0 and embellishes them with the classic Mad Dog moveset, with the only thing missing being the so-called frenzy state you'd enter post a finisher in Zero's iteration. To be more specific, Mad Dog's square combo in Pirate Yakuza functions as a Thug style rush combo in Zero would, whereas mashing triangle here will result in a conventional Mad Dog style combo from Zero. Given that triangle can also be used as a finisher, this means that we finally have a true hybrid style at our disposal, and between its 5 different rush combo iterations, Mad Dog in this game quickly reached the upper echelon of my favorite fighting styles in Yakuza. Other oddities unique to it include an easy launcher while holding square, a great offensive tool with absurd range in the form of jump, the classic tornado move used by holding circle, and a very interesting design choice heralded by the doppelganger mechanic. What I presume was used as a way to prevent repeating the standard EX heat spam that overcame the Judgment games and the first Gaiden, Pirate Yakuza saw it fit to limit your heat gauge, but also implement an extra gauge so you wouldn't feel underpowered by comparison. The Madness gauge fills as you dispatch enemies, basically being a blend of Yakuza 5's special states like Dragon Spirit and the Climax heat mechanic from that game. That is to say, Pirate Yakuza wants you to focus on fundamentals, and only rewards you with truly powerful tech once you've genuinely earned it. Between this and the more deliberate juggle timing a la the one from Gaiden, this is exactly the course correction that Yakuza's combat needed. Cause even in the more recent games that had a ton of fun tech, the vast majority of the community always defaulted to launching and relaunching the enemies ad nauseum. Now, even if you do decide to perpetually spam the newly introduced jump mechanic and this game's juggle iteration, you will still need to be more proactive overall. Keeping an enemy suspended won't keep you out of harm's way for too long, and with the increased enemy numbers and aggression present, the experience this game offers will likely make you a much better player, with a broader perspective on creative combat that will also apply to the older games of the series. I haven't even mentioned the other style in the game yet, which honestly reminds me of the dual sword style from Kenzan at its core. That alone would already be an amazing choice for crowd control, but the thing that really makes this one stand out are the cues that the new style takes from Agent in Gaiden. With Sea Dog, you will also have access to situational tools. In this case, a pistol for great long-range damage, a hook that functions as an inversion of Gaiden's spider gadget, this time drawing your character towards an enemy, and if the hook's mechanics didn't remind you of Devil May Cry already, with that game's Devil Bringer utility, then the fact that you can throw your cutlasses in Pirate Yakuza to temporarily change your rush combo to the classic Thug one will absolutely remind you of the oddities from that game. Specifically, Trish's moveset with the Sparda Devil Arm. Also, as an analog to the Madness gauge giving you doppelgangers in Mad Dog, Sea Dog gives you access to different types of summons through the Dark Instruments that are gradually uncovered through side content. They're a great choice for more crowd control options, and can even help you set up more juggling opportunities in the case of something like the first Dark God you get access to. Now, granted, I can see people having more trouble with Sea Dog than with Mad Dog. if only due to the launchers here feeling less intuitive than a standard hold square type of input, and the finishers having a significantly longer animation. But investing your time in learning Sea Dog's intricacies will absolutely pay off. You have the necessary tools to close distance, the potential for creative vertical combat, and a powerful panic button to build towards if things go awry. Lastly, you'll notice how this game has more gun-wielding enemies than some of the games directly preceding it. So to prevent an infuriating experience of playing Where's Waldo in this Sea of Thieves, RGG implemented a nice indicator as to when you're at risk of being shot. Some people will likely hate this, but personally, unless we went the DMC route of preventing enemy aggression if an opponent was off-screen, then these indicators were the only way to make this addition actually feel meaningful and serve as a nice ramp-up to the overall challenge. Is there anything in particular that I hated about the combat? Well, my criticism in this regard more so relates to another design choice that is making its return from past entries. Much like in Gaiden, Pirate Yakuza saw it fit to necessitate dual currencies to unlock your entire moveset, as well as locking incredibly important tech behind attaining a specific pirate level through some of the side content. Much like the over-reliance on mandatory side content, this has to go. I could excuse the use of real currency and Akame points in Gaiden as a nice nod to Yakuza 0's skill acquisition, but the fact we're adding even more boundaries in Pirate Yakuza between the player and the peak of the combat system means that the vast majority of people will just have a worse experience here than in most of the main lines. Granted, players should be rewarded for exploring the game, and you shouldn't be overpowered just by doing the critical path, but while people like me, who already go for the platinum in every Yakuza game, won't be affected by these added stipulations, most other players will. Once again, if the game is fun enough, people will play it without being nudged into something, and given how diverse this community is, some people may only want to get all the upgrades and do creative combo videos with the boss encounters, meaning that forcing them to grind specific side activities for too long could lead to more complaints on this game in the future, even though an amazing experience is there, just held back with some misplaced design choices. Thankfully, the fact we have New Game Plus available from the get-go is, once again, a way to mitigate this issue moving forward, and I highly urge everyone to replay this game once you've unlocked most of the moveset, especially if you felt like the game pulled you into too many directions during your first run. New Game Plus is Pirate Yakuza at its best, and your opinions of the game could be vastly more positive once you experience it, as was the case for games like Lost Paradise and Ishin for the community in the past. Moving on from the combat, let's briefly address another divisive aspect of this entry, the story. I've seen a ton of people write this game off just by nature of the pirate premise and an amnesia plotline. I've also seen heaps of reviewers complain how the story wasn't as emotionally gripping as the likes of Zero. And to me, while I understand where these individuals are coming from, you need to take into account what a story is intended to be before you judge it. With regards to the whole emotional side of the debate, not every game needs to hit your feelings in the proverbial crotch to still be a great Yakuza game. And conversely, the fact this game has Majima become a pirate for a while doesn't mean it is going to lack the classic Yakuza appeal and identity. To start off, no one but Majima could pull off an amnesiac pirate plot well, and for anyone saying that this is just RGG leaning into the supposedly overtly silly tones of post-Yakuza 0 Majima, need I remind you that one of the alternate takes for the story of Yakuza 3 was going to include Kiryu suffering from amnesia? The reason why an otherwise cliched plotline makes sense in Pirate Yakuza is because Majima is one of the few characters whose psychological development necessitated the construction of different social masks to be utilized. This means that removing the path that allowed him to construct said masks would present us with an interesting paradigm to counteract the cliché. Who is Majima without his brotherly bonds to Saejima? Who is he without the lessons learned from Nishitani, Lee, and Sagawa regarding the premise of tenacity and living an uncaged life? As it turns out, he still retains many of the more caring parts of his personality, shown in how he helped Noah and Jason fulfill their dreams for adventure, and most notably, seen in the motivation for Majima's journey in the first place. Having said that, the ferocious side to his character is absolutely still there, being most evident during Majima's Yubitsume chat on Nele Island, and the moment he reconnected with Saejima. To me, the initial basis of this game feels like the type of clean slate you could only get from a full-on reboot, but RGG actually integrated it in a meaningful way in the context of the franchise as a whole. Majima may not know who he is, but the world around him is largely consistent with what the other games constructed, meaning that the essence of who he is at his core will still react in a driving manner, which becomes clear from his instinct to help Noah at the very beginning of the game all the way to the end. I can't really go into more detail than that, because I'd rather save the in-depth narrative discussions for standalone videos in the future, or a potential spoilercast episode of the RGG cast. But even as someone who is very nitpicky about the stories of the series, I enjoyed the narrative of Pirate Yakuza quite a bit, because the game knew what it wanted to be from the start and never pretended to be something else. As a final addendum, the more adventurous sides of the story remind me of the reinvigorated way Kiryu acted when he started running his orphanage. We see the core of a beloved character being allowed to do what they enjoy, for a time unburdened by their Yakuza legacy or much of the trauma that they lived through. You know Majima will find his way back by the end of this journey, so let him have his fun while he can. It's still the character we all know and love in the end. Now, moving on to the topic of the overall cast, I'm a bit more split on this. Looking at all the new characters introduced, there are some that I find very likable despite the limited screen time, then there's some that are just there, and there are some characters that are just annoying, deliberately or otherwise. For example, I've eventually warmed up to Jason, Noah, and Naomi, and the way their respective aspirations evolved throughout the game felt natural and satisfying to help with. The villain's side also had a number of individuals I adored, despite them having significantly less screen time than we're used to. So the likes of Mortimer, Queen Michelle, and Shigaki, probably being the most prominent between them, all felt like memorable additions to the adventure, comparable to some lesser-known fan favorites from the PS2 era of Yakuza. Then, on the side of things, we have characters like Masaru, Rodriguez, and a number of cast members that are largely plot devices, despite some nice moments, like Tucker and Moana. I don't feel particularly positive or negative towards them, given that they fulfill their roles adequately, but I doubt they will develop a cult following in the community moving forward. And then on the other side of the spectrum, individuals like Raymond, Jack the Collector, Keith, and a handful of others are just nothing characters that are merely there to be hateable faces and prominent roadblocks. Now, granted, if the intent with these characters was to write them like the numerous underwhelming villains of, say, Yakuza 2 or 4, further adding to the idea that the interactions between the main characters and spectacle of the game are the focus of the story, rather than having deeply engaging clashes of ideals come to pass, then I think even these characters technically do their job as intended. You were never meant to like characters like Sengoku from Yakuza 2, Katsuragi from 4, or Kanae from 5, after all. But even with that in mind, I can easily see people using some of Pirate Yakuza's less notable villains as the representation of why the story failed to grip them. Raymond is easily the biggest offender in that regard, and I've already seen people knock the entire finale of this game for not being an idealistic clash in the ranks of Nishiki and Mine due to his inclusion. As I've said, I really wasn't a fan of him either, but between the great character moments bookending the final clash, the amazing long battle through Atlantis, and the uplifting epilogue of the journey as a whole, I don't see why this guy's writing would put a damper on the whole journey, especially when we consider how the presentation of the fight is still great. Plus, this is hardly the only final boss in the series with questionable writing, so I hope people will look at the story as a whole before judging it in the future. That aside, the treatment of the older characters in Pirate Yakuza was absolutely endearing and exactly what I wished it to be. The writing of Saejima? Love it. All of it. and I'm usually one of the most critical people towards his writing from Yakuza 5 onwards. But here, the whole "you're my Kyodai" bit actually felt meaningful, predominantly due to Majima, at first, calling out the absurdity of sticking by bonds that the other person knows nothing about. Once you see Saejima accept the current state of affairs for the time, and stick by Majima for the rest of this bizarre adventure, it makes everything between their exchange after the torture scene, to the final long battle, to the epilogue at the Toto Hospital, feel more meaningful than anything Saejima has done from Yakuza 6 onwards, personally speaking. Same thing with the grandiose return of Nishida and Minami. They're still the goofballs from back in the day, completely loyal to Majima, and we even had talks of resurrecting Majima Kensetsu with them. The writing here is precise, cute, and doesn't overstay its welcome, and if you wanted more time to bond with them, I'd highly urge you to seek out the party chats across the ocean. You won't be disappointed. Lastly, to address the real star of the show, Goro is amazing, even with barely a word being spoken. Moving on to the OST, it's a pretty weird one to describe, but I mean that in a good way. Stylistically, it, at times, feels like a mishmash of the more orchestral tracks from the series, a la the most recent Tyrant of the Tides, coupled with some Pirates of the Caribbean-esque soundscapes that Hans Zimmer composed over time. Then, there are also aspects that would put some of the songs closer to the Yakuza 0 soundtrack, with one of the better examples being a track like the Mad Dog style theme. And there is also a lot of sonic choices that bring this OST much closer to the modern Yakuza OSTs than those of the older games. I feel the need to point this out because I profusely praised Gaiden's OST for the heavier choices and more metal production with the boss themes. So you obviously won't be getting that from this game. But I honestly adored that Pirate Yakuza knew what identity it wanted to build for itself, and how when you observe its OST as a whole, it truly managed to distinguish itself from all the other games. I've seen some people that didn't really get a particularly positive or negative impression of the OST at all, and I should note that the same thing happened with me for a while, by nature of how many enemies you'd have to dispatch in a regular deck battle, or how aggressive some of the bosses were. I frequently found the music in this game to be drowned out by this noise, but once I checked out the OST on YouTube and went back to do some side stuff, it finally clicked with me as the other Yakuza soundtracks. Some personal favorites from this game include Raise the Sails, The Crow Queen, Now or Never, Glacial Surge, and the remix Wildfire, which is just a brilliant remix like the one from Ishin. Also, to briefly touch on the karaoke here, given how we're still talking about music, we got a really nice collection of tracks here. Returning songs include 24 Hour Cinderella, As Long As You're Happy, and much to my joy, the Dead Souls version of Get to the Top, with vastly more forgiving button prompts. As for the new tracks, while I'm not a big fan of The Sun at 36.5 degrees Celsius and Journey to the New World, as I prefer heavier and more somber songs in the series, the Goro Pirates theme and Midnight Desire are genuinely flawless additions. Loved everything from the visuals, to the instrumentation, to the vocal melodies. You might notice how there's one specific track that I've omitted from discussing in this section, but don't worry, we'll address it once we get to the DLC portion of this video. With that said, let's move on to the next topic. Exploration. A grand improvement over Guidance, which I already adored, Pirate Yakuza gives us a myriad of locales to visit, so let's do a brief rundown of them. Honolulu is effectively the same size as the version from Infinite Wealth, though I honestly enjoyed traversing it much more in this game. It might be due to the added verticality from Majima's hook and the new search mode function, or it might be that Majima just feels like he moves faster than Ichiban? That might just be me, but I felt like getting anywhere in Infinite was a chore if you weren't constantly fast traveling off the main map or always sticking to the Street Surfer, which still has the limited battery life. Hell, maybe I'm just more used to the map, so now I'm imagining things. But either way, I can see myself returning to Pirate Yakuza's iteration of the city much sooner, between the extra side content, the heaps of treasure, and the combat that's much more up my alley. Then we have the smaller scale maps, starting with Rich Island. To me, this locale symbolically felt like what Shinseicha was in Yakuza 2. A comfy spot off the beaten path that has a charm of its own, and a handful of amenities specific to that map. In this case, the likes of the rich family bar and the Goro Kingdom animal hangout. On the other hand, Nele Island might as well be considered as a deleted area by comparison, cause there's really nothing to do there. But the novelty of being in such a plot-relevant spot from Infinite feels sort of endearing by itself. Wouldn't call it a spot you'll frequently revisit though. And then we have Madlantis, effectively this game's take on Gaiden's Castle, and like it, basically a spiritual successor to what Purgatory was in the franchise's early days. It has a really bizarre layout, but hits that red light district vibe that the likes of Kamurocho would instill in the player. It gives you access to a unique iteration of the Colosseum, mainly focusing on boat combat and clan creator-esque fights a la the ones from Gaiden. But Madlantis also houses a vastly improved version of the petting minigame that made me want to do every course from the get-go. As with the other maps in Pirate Yakuza, you'll have an absurd amount of items scattered all over the place, recruitable pirates, bounties to hunt, which, don't worry, we'll get to in a bit. So, if you were concerned that the charm of the pirate theme wouldn't translate from the trailer footage to gameplay, you shouldn't be. Personally, I tend to prefer having a selection of small but unique locales, rather than having two massive spots that are just collectathons with 20-hour extra travel time in between. Meaning that Pirate Yakuza's approach felt more in line with the old days of Yakuza, where every corner felt like it had a story to tell. While we're on the topic of exploration, you know how everyone was curious about ship traversal? Well, speaking as someone who forgot to upgrade any of the ship stats or develop better cannons until entering Premium Adventure, which, yes, means that I did the fight against the Queen's fleet woefully underprepared, and yes, that was a pain. Wait, I feel like I got sidetracked. Oh, right, the ship traversal. It honestly felt floaty enough to not feel overtly sluggish, but weighty enough to not make you imagine like you're driving Kiryu's taxi from 5 across the ocean. Initially, the travel speed coupled with the continuous combat encounters might feel too limiting, so take some advice from me, pay attention to your upgrades. You'll eventually get the ability to boost up to 5 times without your boost gauge having filled up, and the resource for that mechanic can be found all around the sea, or as a reward from the ship battles. Between that, the drifting mechanic, and the various boosts around the areas, sailing becomes much more intuitive and free-flowing before you know it. As for what you'll be looking for while sailing, it's of course some classic pirate's treasure. Every island you can visit functions like a visually much prettier version of Ishin's dungeons. They reward you for exploration, give you more combat encounters, and there's also a side narrative tied to a particular pirate crew haunting all of these self-sufficient sea locales. At the end of these explorations, you'll be rewarded with treasures that give you both money and pirate points, as well as increase your pirate rank with each item collected. It gets really addictive after a while, especially in Premium Adventure, when you've unlocked many of the upgrades. And on that note, I just love that so much of the content in this game is focused on combat, given how much of an improvement this game is mechanically compared to what came before in the Dragon Engine. Even though oddities like the Colosseum in Madlantis don't function like its analogs in Gaiden, you'll have more than enough mini-bosses and meaty combat encounters to keep you hunting for more. Overall, exploration gets my stamp of approval. And then we get to the side content, which is frankly a part of the video I'm still dreading as I'm typing this very segment. So, you know how Infinite Wealth had so much stuff in to where you could barely wrap your head around it? Well, while a number of activities are carried over to Pirate Yakuza, it still felt like a lot to take in, and this is coming from someone who already platinumed Infinite. Anyway, back to the point, yes, this game is stacked. We have a ton of returning activities, including but not limited to pool, darts, crazy delivery, golf, mahjong, the gambling minigames, Onabara Vocational School, a slightly expanded variety of Sega arcade games. I definitely mispronounced that last one, but I'm still gonna leave that part in. Effectively, it's what you've come to expect from a modern Yakuza release, and the quality standard and polish, to me, feels as persistent as always, so hey, no complaints here. Then we have some modified returning treats, a la Dragon Card, which was a very nice surprise considering its absence from Infinite. I guess RGG just needed more time to finalize the Hawaii tracks, but they did it. And I love the minigame here as much as in Yakuza 7. The only thing to note is how, apparently, the cards feel floatier in 7, so take that for what it's worth. I still thought that the minigame was quite fun. Now, a massive improvement over past iterations of a given minigame would be this game's iteration of batting. I'm usually very much opposed to batting due to the platinum requirements of the pre-Dragon Engine games being quite unrelenting, though that opposition has admittedly lessened over time, considering the overpowered bats that the DE games would give you to cheese the requirements. But then you have Pirate Yakuza's take, and it's just absurdly fun. As you can see, you can blow up heaps and heaps of barrels, eventually taking aim at the treasure chest. The UI looks much simpler, but there's actually a lot more strategy involved here, considering the special types of targets that appear. And this quickly made the activity one of my personal highlights in this game. The critical path will necessitate you give it a go, but I'd honestly recommend giving it a proper shot once you're in actual free roam in Medlantis on top of it. The cooking minigame technically makes a return from the way its fragments from Another Life functioned in Ishin, and I appreciate that quite a bit, as it makes Rich Island feel all the more cozy for revisits, given that this is the spot that introduces you to this activity, as well as the Goro Kingdom, i.e. your personal safe haven of diverse wildlife. It almost feels like Pirate Yakuza took all of the creative choices from Dondoko Island, removed the actual resource management in that regard, and crystallized what was left to make a fun, relaxing experience that doesn't overwhelm you with daily tasks and alike. Now, another personal favorite of mine in terms of side content are the bounties. Realistically, we've had games with a variety of mini-bosses roaming the streets, either of a come and get them variety, a la in Kiwami 2's Majima Saga and the martial artists in the Kurohyo games, or with things like the Keihin Gang in Judgment. But the bounty implementation in Pirate Yakuza reminds me the most of the Hitman missions from Yakuza 3. We have a wide selection of bosses to fight, great monetary rewards, and we even skipped over Yakuza 3's tedium of having to go back and forth from the Honest Living Association to get a new target. There's a ridiculous amount of these all around Honolulu and Medlantis, so even if you do a bunch of them in a multi-hour sitting, you'll likely still have some more left to experiment on, with your ring loadouts and newly obtained combat upgrades. Next up is customization, and holy hell, it has literally everything I could ask for, and I do mean everything. From 80s Majima to classic snakeskin, to Hanya Man, to Goromi, to the Ichiban outfits, to the Kiryu suits, if you subscribe to the newsletter, which I still didn't get the code for. You even have Yagami's and Sugiura's outfits as well as a Daidoji style getup. You can already see a ton of these in the demo, and the full game is even more outlandish as it turns out. Even if you fall into the category of calling this game quote-unquote too silly, and you'd rather have Majima not look like a pirate while wielding Sea Dog, you can dress him up as you wish. We're basically talking about mod-type freedom being built into the appearance system on every single console. I feel like there's so many things that I've listed so far, and yet there's God knows how much present in the game that I haven't sunk my teeth into yet. I believe the only thing that I haven't addressed in some capacity that is still a notable addition would be the Minato Girls activity. But frankly, even with my vocabulary, I find myself at a loss for words while trying to distill this experience into anything remotely comprehensive. You just have to see it for yourselves, preferably with a bottle of rum if you are of age. And with all of that out of the way, let's move on to the final sections of this video. Now, if you'll recall from my review of Infinite Wealth, the DLC discussion was integrated as part of the overall negatives of that game. So I'm happy to say that the nature of this DLC package is a vast improvement over the previous one. New Game Plus is now a part of the Day 1 patch, rather than a luxury commodity. And again, I can't be happier about it, because while the mode itself isn't currently on disc, it is still available for free and lets you re-experience this adventure at its mechanical peak, as it was always intended. Now if only the original Gaiden was just as lucky as this year concludes. Sorry, got sidetracked again. As I was saying, the DLC this time is an improvement, as we've gone back to the way that the content functioned in the early days of the Dragon Engine. The vast majority of the material obtained in the deluxe edition of the game pertains to cosmetics for Majima and his ship, extra helpful crewmates that take the form of various characters with relevance to the Mad Dog's life in the 80s and beyond, essentially the type of stuff we're kind of used to seeing since Yakuza 6. The only addition to this package that I could see as divisive is the addition of the Majima Kensetsu anthem into the karaoke minigame, or perhaps the CD collection for your free roam music player. Being a content creator, and someone who rarely used the music player even during my casual grind in Infinite Wealth, I just see the latter addition here as a nice bonus, rather than something that will massively alter my gameplay experience, though I understand why people would still take issue with that choice on principle. As for Majima Kensetsu, it really is unfortunate that a beloved track is exclusive to DLC. I'd be even sadder if a track like Majima no Majirok was part of that buyer incentive, but on the somewhat bright side, at least the construction anthem is present at all here. If it's any consolation, fellow Yakuza diehards already know how fast these games go on sale, so if you're not sure about the DLC at this moment, you can just wait for a bit, though you're really not missing out on much content either way. As for the negatives, beyond some of the design choices I already pointed out, like the mandatory side content, the nature of skill unlocking, and the like, my only remaining criticism is a simple one. It's the fact that Majima no Majirok isn't available for karaoke. Is it a very nitpicky thing to say this late in a review? Yes. But then again, I wouldn't be the resident Kurohyo enthusiast if I didn't do that. That song is genuinely amazing, and its composers are still working with RGG from what I can recall, so it's a shame that the song wasn't reprised here. But other than that, I feel like you can get a clear picture of how I view this specific Yakuza game. Does it have its downsides? Yes, every game in the series does, but the overall package, in my opinion, is more than worth your time. As of the writing of the script, I would place Pirate Yakuza as my 10th favorite game in the franchise, ranking roughly at the top of an A tier in a dedicated list of sorts. We'll see how my opinion evolves as I play more of the game, but given that Gaiden is still in my top 5 favorite Yakuza games after over a year had passed, I'm guessing a similar trend will repeat with Pirate Yakuza. So yeah, play it, now. Let me know what you thought about the game, and feel free to suggest any other topics for me to cover down the line. Thank you for your patience, and I hope you enjoyed your stay. So, until next time, take care of yourselves, and have a great day. Cheers!